And I think today's topic, I'm just going to talk about the most recent anime I finished, which was Attack on Titan. I was reading reactions to the ending online, and I know I'm a little behind the ball, but I just finished it up. Uh, but a lot of the reactions, I guess it was from people that had either been following the manga since it first dropped, or people who were, part of the hype train of the show since 2012 when it first came out. I remember hearing about it when it first dropped. I was a freshman in high school, and there was a lot of hype around it. I didn't watch it at the time, but a lot of the reactions that I've seen from people who've, been with the show and the kind of tumultuous history that show has in terms of like switching developers, switching production times, the first and second season being almost, I believe the first season dropped 2012, 2013. Second season didn't come out till 2017, which is a pretty large gap. And then the third season was 2019, and then the final season ranged between 2021 to the end of 2023. So it's been like a real journey. It's been a decade-long journey to tell this full story in its totality. And a lot of people didn't like the ending. A lot of people thought the ending was very bleak, thought the ending was disappointing in that it didn't fulfill the romance story that a lot of people thought it was going to terminate with, between Mikasa and Eren. Personally, like, when I think about their story, the love story, or the kind of star-crossed love story that those two characters have, I think from the jump, there's no guarantee that they're going to get together. I know, like in anime, like the whole, the common trope in anime is, it's a will they or won't they situation, and generally it takes seasons for two characters that are clearly in love with each other to confess feelings or to make a certain move. There's, entire shows like Love is War that revolve around that trope and make a parody of that trope. Taking the most extreme sense of human pride and stretching it to the nth degree, where the two characters involved are just completely, unwilling to cede any territory to one another and cede their feelings to one another. So, I mean, I understand that trope, the audience likes to see that fulfilled. It is like a sigh of relief to see that fulfilled. And the fact that you don't really see that fulfilled, you really don't see that, come to a resolution while the two characters are living, is probably very upsetting for people who were, shipping that relationship, or they wanted that to have the resolution. I think the tragedy of the story is you have in the final movie, the final installment, you have that opening scene where Eren and Mikasa, in an alternate future, right, in what could have been, in that vision that Eren projects to Mikasa, you have that really beautiful vision of, like, yeah, he's doomed, and yeah, there's people chasing him, but he has the woman that he loves, and she's going to stick by him no matter what. While I like that vision of the future, I don't think that that's what the show was about. From the very first episode, it's like, yes, he has this rage. It's directed towards the Titans, right? But the first thing he says is he's getting on the boat from Shiganshina when his home is taken away from him. It's, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to kill them all. And I think the story and the arc of this story fulfills that very base, very simple intention that he had as a child. I thought the incorporating nationalism or ultra-nationalism into the story itself made season 4 a lot more engaging. I thought I was, as a viewer when I was watching the show, I thought season 1 was fantastic. I thought the arc, at times it was a little drawn out, but I think overall the story and the mystery of season 1 is fantastic. And the resolution and the arc of Aaron's character of being loyal to a fault, right? Like wanting to not believe that Annie is who she is. And even up to the last moment, begging her on the stairs, saying, just come down here and talk. Wanting to believe anything but the fact that, she's an enemy that was tasked with, seizing him, tasked with seizing the founder. Of course they don't know that at the time, but I think that the mystery of that, and also the arc of Aaron's character and that unwillingness to, being loyal to a fault for his friends, and then having the realization that he's been deceived, right? I think overall that's a great arc. I think season 2, I know it's a trope, or I know it's common to be everybody's favorite scene, but I think my favorite scene of season 2 is, again, it's the arc right after Stoas, and there's this mystery of the Beast Titan. Again, they do a great job of incorporating the Beast Titan and incorporating the strange mystery behind this, behind this new character, and they really draw that out to really the end of season 3. But the great thing about season 2 is they double down on that betrayal, right? It's informing Aaron's later decisions. Like this betrayal, this compounded betrayal, makes him in season 4 seek out loyalists. Not just loyalists, ultra loyalists, right? People that are willing to sacrifice their children on the altar of nationalism, as Grisha says in late season 4. So that betrayal and the compounding of that betrayal really is an important moment for Aaron. And the scene I'm talking about is when Reiner and Bertolt reveal that they were the ones who destroyed his home, the Colossal and the Armored. And that scene's great just because, it also really fleshes out Reiner's character. It really shows this split and this want to be accepted, and being in too deep, playing undercover way too deep, right, has gotten to Reiner. And I think it adds a lot of dimension and depth to his character, which again later on in the show informs his decision to confront Aaron. So and the scene that follows, where Aaron is enraged and he's fighting Reiner down at the base of the wall, and his inevitable capture is just an amazing culmination, because it is the death of, it's the final nail in the coffin in his innocence, right? It's the final moment where he's realized that the people that he's trained with, the people that he calls brothers and sisters, have been deceiving him all this time. And it wasn't just Annie, it was, somebody who he saw as a role model, somebody who he respected. And then you get to, you get to the end of season 2, where they go and they rescue Eren. Ymir sacrifices herself. Basically, basically in exchange for Eren's life. And then I think around the first half, my biggest problem with the show is the first half of season 3. I like everything with Kenny to a certain degree. I like his relationship with the King of the Wall, and I love what he has to say about what drives and motivates people, and how, essentially people at their core, their motivations all make them the same, right? They all want the same thing. I think that's interesting. I think the first half of season 3 is a bit drawn out. They had to do a lot of legwork to contrive this explanation for how Eren got a hold of the Founder. It's the bumpiest area in terms of plot, and I think that's pretty indisputable. Some people really love it. Some people really like it's like the meme of Levi shouting, "Ken!" But I think overall, it is like the weakest point in the show, and it introduces the most amount of information and a lot of important details very fast, and at times it feels like they're rushing things. So it's both drawn out in that it feels like they could have told the story in a more succinct way. They could have they could have told the story in a more succinct way, but also there were moments in that 13 episode sequence where it was just a deluge of information. A lot of important information that later, that informs, a lot of the decisions and a lot of the plot events that happen in the end of season 3 and the end of season 4. The second half of season 3 is great. I think Bertholdt's completed arc is really interesting. I think him deciding that he's going to choose, he's going to choose his warrior, his position as warrior over his friends, over his loved ones, right, is a very powerful moment. And there's a lot of characters in the show that betray their friends, betray their loved ones, betray the people that gave them an identity for the sake of their mission, right? So it was interesting to see, because Bertolt at the end of season 2 was so hesitant, and he was sobbing, and he was shaken and absolutely bereft that he had betrayed friends and didn't think he was capable of facing them. And so it's interesting to see that he has that courage to face him, and then he meets his demise. And I think it's an interesting decision in following his in his demise, of choosing between Erevan and Armin. I think that is the strongest point in the season. And a lot of people disagree, and they think Erevan would have been a better fit. And I think if Erwin had been chosen over Armin, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think the outcome of the rumbling would be fairly similar if it was Armin versus Erwin facing off against each other. I like the fact that Armin's chosen. I think it's actually important that Armin's chosen, but I don't think the outcome of the rumbling would be any different, because I don't think based on Erwin's character and based on what you know of his childhood, right, and his intense interest in the world beyond the wall, it's very similar to Armin. They're very similar in that interest. Erwin's Erwin's a hardened military commander, right? So there is a level of, I guess there is a question of whether or not he would be swayed by the Jaegerists, I guess, but I think if anything, he might have been better at curbing Eren and curbing the extremism that created the Jaegerists, but he was also, in a lot of ways, a man of a different era, right? It would be like, it's kind of similar to, I think about it historically, it's kind of similar to the First World War, where you had a lot of these commanders from the Franco-Prussian War, a lot of these commanders who had even, some of them who had even studied under people who had seen the Napoleonic expansions, right, where they go into World War One with a misunderstanding of the technology, and it's actually interesting because the commanders and the officers had a shorter life expectancy than the privates, the corporals, and the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, when during World War One, and in a lot of ways it's reflecting of both men that were not prepared for the changing dynamics of warfare, and men who had a target on their back, because you're more likely to be targeted if you're somebody who's an officer, somebody who's leading the charge, right? So, in a lot of ways, it's like Erwin is a man of a different era. So I do think, if anything, he might have been able to curb the extremism, and he might have been the figure that would have kept the Jaegerists from having as much pull on the political establishment in Eldia as they did. So there's the pros and cons of having him around. I do think, though, that say hypothetically, even in the case where Erwin is chosen and the Jaegerists succeed in their coup, I think Erwin is making similar actions to Armin. I think Erwin's making similar actions to combating, the destruction of the world that the outside world he's so curious of. And then, maybe my only other problem with season 3 is transferring your consciousness to your body. I think that was almost unnecessary. They blow up Reiner's skull, and he transfers his consciousness to his body just in the nick of time. I thought it was a little... I think he could have been wounded in a different way, where he's either knocked out or I just think his brain being intact is actually a lot more interesting than what they decided to do. And then it was never brought up again because I think they thought that it was a silly plot point. I'm a lot more on board, just by comparison, in terms of the story, I'm a lot more on board with Aaron getting his head shot off by Gabi than I am Reiner getting his head blown off and his body being able to rebuild itself, right? Or being able to rebuild his brain and his mind. Just because his head's still intact, right? And there is that whole moment where that founding entity, whatever that kind of weird parasitic thing is, extends from his spine and connects itself to, I can, suspension of disbelief, I like that. I think that's a lot more believable and a lot cooler of a mechanic than the Reiner thing, and I think there's a reason they didn't bring that back. I'm more on board with seemingly mortal wounds of the body and the Titan, the Titan holders being able to survive that than I am with the head. And I think there's also a scene. There's actually also a scene where Peak. This is in the middle of season 4, where Peak confronts Eren right before Galliard tries to seize the Founder, where Peak says to him, "The bullet moves faster than you can transform," right? And so that's what prompts. It's like that. That's where it falls apart, right? It's like I like the belief that, or I like to think that in the world there's some consistency where, the head has to be intact, the brain has to be intact, and I think season 3. The only reason I rank season 3 kind of the lowest on the scale, it's not because there aren't great plot points in that season. It's really just because there's a lot of creative liberties that they took that either didn't lend themselves to much later on in the show or just felt sort of absurd and kind of like jumped the shark just a little bit. I think season 4 does a really excellent job of tightening that up. I think season 4 does a fantastic job of sort of shaving off the absurdities of season 3 and trying to create something, something more cohesive that's easier for people who are viewing it to follow and understand. Maybe people don't like it because of the animation. The animation change between Wit and Mappa is jarring. I agree with that. It is a very distinct difference, right? And there's a lot of that 3D sort of modeling that you have in season 4, and at times that 3D modeling doesn't look great. It can look a little choppy. But I know it might just be recency bias, but I really do love season 4. I'm conflicted when I say I actually enjoy season 4 more as a standalone story. I know it's like, well, it's not a standalone series. It's a standalone, story. It's in a series. But I also like it in conjunction with the rest of the show. But I absolutely love the arc, the first arc of season 4. I think it was really clever to do something similar to what was done in season 1, where in season 1 there are enemies in your midst, right? So it's the perspective of behind the walls, something horrible happens and there's an enemy among them, right? And I love that they do a similar thing in season 4. I love the use of the internment zones. I love the spiritual and philosophical battles of a humanist view of the world versus this nationalist or ultra-nationalist view. that a lot of people in Eldia are gravitating towards, right? And the, wanting to reinstitute the Eldian Empire, right? And that want to achieve and even surpass previous greatness is really, it's a really, because that's a type of political currency that's very real in the world today, right? Where people promise, like there are nationalists everywhere who promise that they're going to make a better future for the people in their little corner of the world, and it's a very powerful message that people gravitate towards, and it allows people to do awful things in the service of some greater achievement, some greater reinstitution of or maintenance of their greatness. So and it also, the show does an excellent job of showing how destructive and poisonous that type of thinking, that type of political ideology does, creates in its extreme. I think I think the most interesting thing is you have, something of, something of similar tragedy happening in the opening of season 4, where Aaron has that conversation with Reiner, and he has a more mature worldview. He's not hanging on to the bitterness of betrayal so much in that interaction he has with Reiner. But it is this fatalistic and realist moment where, and when I like strategic realism, right? This realist moment where he's sitting with Reiner and they're having this conversation about, how Reiner was following orders, and he went there with a mission that he felt very strongly to fulfill. Felt very strongly that he needed to fulfill. And the terminus of their exchange is, "I'm just like you." And it's that tragedy where he, at the very least, Reiner was a child. He was a propagandized child when he made the decisions that he made in Parody. Aaron is an adult, and he recognizes that in order to achieve his goals, as horrific as those goals are, he has to become the same type of person that perpetrated, the evils that happened to him in his childhood. There's a British lord who said something to the effect, I'm forgetting his name, but he said something to the effect that every school child knows that those who do evil, those who have had evil done to them will do evil unto others, right? And it is this cyclical violence and people wanting to escape this cyclical ethnic violence and approaching it and looking for resolutions, and the human frailty and human failings and the realist perspective of survival is paramount, right? Survival of the nation, survival of the entity and the ethnic, the ethnic culture of Eldia is, for Eren, it's contingent on the destruction of the rest of the world, because they're so despised worldwide because of this oppressive history that they have, this, undignified, horrific denigration that the peoples of the world have experienced at the hands of Eldia. Those sins will have to be repaid one day, right? And so Eren's looking at that, understanding that the hatred is so deep, so profound, and his solution is horrific. His solution is a solution that, frankly, a lot of real-world people, real-world politicians, real-world leaders have decided time and time again to pursue. It's just taken to the nth degree, because it would be like if, say, hypothetically, in a real world historical hypothetical, it would be like if the Third Reich had gotten the bomb before the Americans did, and they were able to use that technology with impunity, because nobody could retaliate against it, right? So it is like, Eren holds the nuclear button, and he has a say on who lives and who dies. I love the I love the fact that the Attack Titan can see into the future. And it does play into the overall fatalism of the show, right? Where I think another aspect as to why Eren is so resolved in that moment when he's talking to Reiner and he says, "I'm just like you," is both in part that he knows that the only way that he sees to preserve his island, to preserve his people, is to carry out the destruction of the rest of the world. He chooses his loved ones, he chooses the people he cares about over the entire world, and at the expense of the entire world. Which is what a lot of people have done, but it's also informed by this realization that there are things in the future, that there are things to come that are out of his control and that are guaranteed to happen. They never really go into depth of the mechanics of this future sight. It's hard to say if his actions have much sway over his decision make or over the outcomes of these events, or maybe because they never explicitly say that if he chooses a different path, the outcome will be different. It's almost like he's, as he says in his final conversation with Armin, when they're in this dream state, sitting amongst the pulverized remains of the entire world, or 80% of the world. He says, "I'm a slave to freedom." So in a lot of ways, he's like a slave to his own fate, where there were so many factors at play. There was so much. The future was treacherous for Eldia in every possible way. Even with Armin's vision, right? Where Armin's intention was like, oh, you create a small rumbling of 90 or 100 or so Titans to destroy the Marleyan or the world military armada that was forming in Marley. Even that, is not ensuring the survival of Eldia for a long period of time. And what the terrifying and inevitably inevitable, that's so sorry, that was a stupid way of phrasing it, but what ends up happening is you have this push towards the rumbling by people who have all different visions of the future. You have Zeke, who, through his own self-hatred, through his own want to not exist in this world, because life was such a deep hell for him growing up and maddeningly unfair, and he was always kind of pushed by the wills of people who had a greater say in his life, right? So he was a slave to the wills of others, right? And the tragedy of Zeke's character is, even in his strongest moment, where he thinks he has Aaron on the ropes, and he thinks that Aaron is a propagandized nut who was swayed by his father to fulfill this destiny. Even then, he is a complete slave to Aaron's will. And the tragedy of Zeke's character is, even in his moment where he thinks he has his aha moment, I've decided that I'm going, that I'm going to leave here with you as my brother, and I'm going to change your mind about what Grisha has taught you. It's like, oh no, turns out that part of him was endogenous. That facet of Aaron's, that stubborn, suicidal, nationalistic aspect to Aaron's character, or extreme. Maybe it becomes nationalism, or actually, I shouldn't say it becomes nationalism. It really isn't about. For Aaron, it really isn't about nationalism. He leverages nationalism. He leverages ultranationalism. He leverages people like Flock, who is in love with the idea of a greater Eldia. But I think it's actually it's more about love of his friends and love of his family. That motivates him. I don't think I think it was actually a misappropriation of his motives to say that he's purely guided by nationalism. It is an intense loyalty to the people that he loves, which leads him to leverage nationalism to achieve his means, which is, again, like a very tragic circumstance, because the end result of that ultranationalism is at the expense of the world. It's at the expense of this enormous tragedy that ends up happening, this enormous genocide that ends up happening by his hand. So it is really interesting that they're all to some degree a slave to fate. Even you don't. I think what is said of Mikasa, where he's talking about Ackerman blood and how the Ackermans were engineered by the Eldian kings to be loyal to a fault. That I believe they say, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe that is actually BS. That it is her intense devotion and intense love for Aaron that makes her blind to who Aaron became, but also, is the thing that made her protect him to a fault. And I think he does what he does inevitably so that Mikasa lives a long life. And the final scene of the show where she buries him by that tree that they used to lay by when they were children, and there's no walls anymore. It's all gone. And that symbolic oppression, right? That symbolic, that cage that they were kept in is now gone. And what was the price of that? What was the price of leaving that cage? It was something awful. It was a terribly costly price. But inevitably, she is grateful to have known Aaron. Which is really, it's a really difficult... It is such a complex character. It is such a complex... He is such a... that relationship is so complex, and I really think that people wanted that happy ending. They wanted him to choose her. They wanted them to run away to some quiet place so he could die peacefully. And, when it came to Mikasa, I do actually like the fact that it is Mikasa who chooses to end Aaron's life, right? Where she doesn't want to, of course, but she chooses to end his life. And, it is the only... It is the only way that they can save, that the Eldians living, the Eldians that remain, that live outside the wall, the only way that they can continue to live outside the walls would be if they stop Aaron. And so Aaron knows that, right? So Aaron knows that it will have to be at the hands of, his death will have to be, at the hands of somebody who loves him dearly. Which is, another interpersonal, there's the genocidal atrocity that he commits, and then there's the interpersonal tragedy that his friends go through, having to be the ones to kill him, having to be the ones to stop him. And I think it is... I think my reaction to the final kiss that Mikasa shares with Aaron's dead head, it is a little weird, but I get it. I understand that, that was the only way that was probably one of the only ways that she could ever live with herself and live that long life that Aaron wanted her to live. Would be, that small expression of love in a weird way. I do think the scene where they're standing outside the refugee camp that the Marleyans had created by the destruction of those Central Eastern countries it's really interesting, where he asks Mikasa what she is to him, and she doesn't. It really is the ultimate tragedy for the entire world, how them fumbling that moment, results in the worst thing to happen in this in the world of the story, right? Um, the fact that she can't give a straightforward answer to that she loves him and that they should drop everything, say screw all this, say screw this struggle, screw the politics, screw, the fate of everybody. Let us be, let us be actually free and determine our lives the way we wish to determine them. And it's that failure that results in the genocide and the tragedy of the story. And I like, I love where you see what could have been, and how if they had just left, if they had just gone somewhere else, that whole story terminates. That whole story ends. And I think it's hard to say. It's hard to say of what you saw of what could have been, would have been, even if Mikasa had been honest with her feelings. But it was certainly a possibility there. It is one of the best animes I've ever watched. I think season 1 is great. It's a great mystery. Season 2 is another. It adds to the mystery, and it adds to Aaron's character, and it has that amazing scene on the top of the wall where Reiner, you get to see inside Reiner's head a bit. And season 3 is bumpy overall in the first half. Again, a lot of gaps where not a lot is happening, and then there's a deluge of information. And I think they save it in the second half. There's still some quirky, weird components of the second half, but Erwin's speech is fantastic. And the moral dilemma of who to sacrifice and who to save between Armin and Erwin is really interesting. And the revelation that the world outside the wall is a lot more complex and a lot more cruel and a lot more fraught with moral danger than just an enemy that's bent on destroying them. I barely touched on Grisha. I mentioned Grisha once, but just the scene with the owl in season 3, where the owl reflects on how he's had to cut the fingers off of countless patriots, torture, demean, and inevitably change them into titans. And that revelation that he decides to save Grisha, and then shares with Grisha, in an indirect way, that the Attack Titan has the ability to foresee events in the future and be able to, be able to see future lives of the people who inherit it. It's really fascinating. And also it might be too the same way that Grisha's influenced by Eren in that scene where he hesitates to kill the children of the royal family, and then Eren says, they killed your sister, remember, they killed your sister, remember why you're here. That's not the exact quote, but I can imagine that if you're seeing it from the vision Aaron like influencing the actions of the past. You can imagine that, perhaps Aaron standing beside the owl saying something similar, or whispering in the owl's ear something similar. I don't know how that mechanic really works. Maybe that was just something that they were able to do because Zeke and Aaron were in that, the coordinate. They were at the coordinate, so therefore they could go back in the past and see the past and see the events of the past. But I don't know if that's how that worked. But perhaps it could be. That could just be isolated to the fact that they were at the coordinate, and so they could go explore like the past together. But I maybe they never say with a certainty that isn't something that Aaron can do. But I'm a little torn. Maybe somebody in the comments could say like, no, that the only reason Zeke and Aaron were able to have those visions of the past was because they had touched, and he could leverage the full use of the founding Titan. But it is a fantastic story. It's a tragic story. It did something that Game of Thrones in the later seasons really loved. So in Game of Thrones in the later seasons, they were trying to relive the glory of Eddard's death and relive the glory of the Red Wedding and how that upset fans and turned the dynamics of the story right on its ass, and completely flipped the table and flipped the script. They really banked on that, and instead of turning it into something logical, because when Eddard's death is surprising, but it comes about as a result of logical decisions that characters make in the course of the story. And same with the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding comes about with logic, and the tragedy of those two events come from how shocking they are, and come from how it was really, a lot of it was the motivations and the hubris of the characters involved. Like Rob's death is completely on him. He makes in the books it's slightly different, because it's the Westerling girl, and he gets her pregnant, and that's why he ends up marrying her. It's not this woman from Essos who he falls in love with on the battlefield. It's a different story, and it's a different story in the books. But their deaths come about as a result of the decisions that they make. But later on in the show, it becomes pretty gimmicky, where it gets to the point where you're like, oh, I wonder what's gonna happen, right? Like I wonder what topsy-turvy decision a character's gonna make. It's like Littlefinger's death in season 7 makes very little sense. But also I don't think the writers knew how to deal with Littlefinger after season 4. This is not about Attack on Titan right now, and I am sorry, I'm off on a tangent about Game of Thrones, but they really didn't like Littlefinger saving Sansa and then deciding to give her over to the Boltons. Like in the book, he doesn't. In A Dance with Dragons, he doesn't do that. Littlefinger gives Sansa over to... Littlefinger keeps Sansa in the Vale, and he gives Jane Poole... He gives Jane Poole, who's not in the show, but he gives Jane Poole over to the Boltons under the false pretense that Jane Poole is actually Arya Stark. So the whole thing about... It's like the whole thing is that Littlefinger's deceiving his potential political rival by not giving them the thing that the seat of legitimacy that they think they're going to get, right? And so they give over Jane Poole to this, to Ramsay Bolton. And it's like there's actual political scheming. There's no political scheming after season 4 with Littlefinger. And so his death comes about not in like a surprising way. It comes about because he's making stupid decisions for 3 friggin' seasons. And you're like, yeah, finally, drop dead, dude. I don't even understand why you're... Like, it's like your motives are so friggin' convoluted and strange. I can't even wrap my head around it. But, we were talking about, that was a gimmicky thing with Game of Thrones. I think what Attack on Titan did well was, they did have topsy-turvy twist moments, but they never turned it into a gimmick. But they didn't give a certain group of fans the ending that they wanted. The ending that a lot of people wanted was the ending that you saw at the beginning of the last movie, which was Aaron and Mikasa living out their romance. It's pertinent as a plot point because it's showing you like what could have been, and it's showing you, it compounds the tragedy of the ending of this story. But it also, you could also see it as fan service, right? You're also giving the people who've committed a decade of their show this final ship moment of, Aaron and Mikasa, look at them living happily ever after, right? But the motive that Aaron has in the first episode of the show is fulfilled to a horrific degree. He goes, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to kill them all. And he doesn't kill them all. He kills 80% of them. But he certainly achieves the I'm going to stop this part, at least within his lifetime. But still, you have one of the most powerful scenes in the final movie is actually in the end credits, where it's showing the sequence of Mikasa's life, Mikasa's death, what follows with the technological supremacy and the technological boom that happens in Eldia after Aaron's death, and all of these amazing things that have taken place, and this burgeoning huge culture that arises as the new Eldian Empire. And then you see the decay and the structures that were built by Aaron's destruction of the world come crumbling down with 2,000 years of history, or more, however long it is, that in amazingly advanced civilization that comes at the expense of bloodshed is finally undone and finally destroyed. And then you have that brilliant cyclical moment where Aaron's tree that was created from his head, this massive tree that was grown from the fertilizer of the founding Titan, there's an opening in it, and a little boy is standing at the opening, and it's a way of saying this story can and may happen again, right? This cyclical violence, this deep hatred, this blood feud might start anew. So it's like, he ensures within his lifetime and within his children's lifetime, or hypothetical children's lifetime, let's say Mikasa's children's lifetime, that they are safe from outside threats, and they're safe from their status as Eldians being called, their existence being called into question. That's achieved, but it's achieved at an enormously horrific cost. But inevitably that dream is undone. right? And that's what Asayama is showing in those final credits. I think it's an absolutely you cannot get that from a lot of TV shows that are produced in the U.S. or in Britain. It's a very special, very realist view of history, and it's told in a beautiful way. It's tragic, it's horrific, but it really does encapsulate, deep generational trauma, deep generational hatred that allows these blood feuds to persist, both in the real world and in, the world of the Titans. It's a hell of a show. I should have said spoilers from the jump, but maybe I'll just put that in the thumbnail. Hell of a show. Absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed every minute of it, save for a couple of episodes in season 3. But overall, it's got a great run. Definitely recommend it. Sorry for spoiling it if you were coming here to listen to that. But I think that's all I got to say about it for today. You guys have a wonderful time. Thank you for listening to the Portable Karaoke Cast. Have a good one. Follow us on Instagram. Take care.